Okay, that sounds promising. So as I said, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the first in this series of 5 workshops, all around the theme of wild pavements. I'm Amanda Tuke. I'm a nature writer, I'm an urban botanist and birder based in South London. If you're not already passionate about hunting for nature in urban areas, I'm hoping by the end of this you will be. That's my challenge, is to get you all excited about things that you can find in unlikely places today, but in urban areas generally. So my other challenge is, it's only an hour, but what I'm going to try and make sure is that you feel supported and relaxed in this hour. But I'm also going to try and get you to do quite a lot of different things. So my challenge is to stop it feeling too hectic. So hopefully I will achieve that. Just some housekeeping things. If you could please make sure you stay muted when we're doing the writing exercises. If you do have any questions, obviously, particularly if you're new to one of my workshops and unfamiliar with the usual way we do things, if you just pop those in the chat and I'll keep an eye on that while everybody else is scribbling away. I have enabled the live transcription, so if you'd find that helpful, please go into the menu and you can see where to switch that on. So what are we going to do today? Well, this is the plan for the hour. So we're going to do 3 different writing exercises, and the end objective is to lead up to a 50-word piece of what I dub thumbnail nature writing. So 50 words, including the title, if you want a title, and that's going to be what we're aiming for at the end of the hour. We're going to share some readings of nature writing relating to the workshop theme. My pal Paul, who's on the call as well, is going to do some reading for me, so you don't have to listen to my voice all the time. We're going to think about an aspect of creative writing to think about as you rework, edit and polish your writing. And then finally at the end, there'll be an opportunity to share what you've written in the session or any feedback about what things you enjoyed and which things were difficult. So that's the plan. Yes, it sounds like a lot to fit in, doesn't it? But let's crack on with the first writing exercise. So I call this diminishing stories. And the idea is it's a bit of a warm-up, so just a bit of fun. So the idea is to write a 7-sentence story on any subject. It could be nature, it doesn't have to be, but in which the first sentence is, of course, I should have known better. So you'll notice that's 7 words. The second sentence needs to have 6 words, the third sentence 5 words, and so on to a final 7th sentence of just 1 word. So that's the first thing we're going to do. You're going to have about 5 minutes, and I'll give you a 1-minute warning when we get near the end. So have fun. Over to you. I'm going to mute myself, and as I said, any questions, pop them in the chat. So you have a minute left. Okay. So hopefully that's helped you tap into your creativity, flex some writing muscles. And hopefully was also a bit of fun. So what we're going to do next is to share with you some readings. So it's people have written about nature in unlikely places, perhaps not surprisingly. It's when you find something in an area you're not expecting to find it. If you go to a nature reserve, you expect to find nature. But if you're in a city or in an urban area, it can be a surprise, and it can be a really nice surprise and a way of making you feel quite differently about urban areas. So here are some examples of people who've written about finding nature in unlikely places. So I'm going to read the first one, which is by Kerry Brown. So Kerry was a previous workshop participant, and she wrote this piece. The rumble and grind of traffic, like giants gargling pebbles. Constant background humming of cars. Eclipsed by birdsong, rattling magpies, reedy robin, tuneful blackbird, electronic starlings. But I win, I outsing them all. A tiny mouse brown ping pong ball with a machine gun call, louder than everyone. I am here, the wren. What I loved about Kerry's piece when she sent it over was, well, giants gargling pebbles, great. What a fantastic expression that is. I really liked her listing of eclipsed by birdsong, then the rattling magpies, then the robin, then the, so it has a really nice rhythm to it. But also the way she kind of neatly turned it on its head and ended up with the title, The Wren, because of course it could have been the other way around, but it's like a nice kind of reveal at the end of it. So that was a bit of fun. So I'm going to pass over to Paul now, who's going to share Laura's piece with you.
Lovely, and I'm now unmuted. If you're wondering where I'm speaking from, I'm just outside Oxford. It's lovely to be doing this. So this is Laura McShane, another workshop participant from the past. I didn't notice you before by the high housing estate. In lockdown 1.0, your glorious snow crown fell like icing sugar dusted on a cake, replaced by summer's cherries plucked by passers-by. Now you are threadbare, like a lonely man's worn coat. But I see you, and spring will come.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Paul. So in Laura's piece, she managed to span all of the seasons. So you have that real sense of her going back and revisiting that cherry tree once she'd found it. I really liked the lockdown 1.0. That felt very specific, and it kind of makes you go, oh, okay, what's happening here? And then the sort of repetition of, once again, fell like icing sugar, replaced by summer cherries, plucked by passers-by. And that sort of, once again, is a kind of rhythmic device that I think works really well. So on to some published writers. So Richard Mabey is probably our most famous writer about plants in the UK. And this was in a book called Weeds. The modern equivalent to the train hopping of Oxford ragwort is the trunk road hitchhiking of Danish scurvy-grass. Up to the 1980s, Cochlearia danica was a scarce native of the drier areas of the coasts around Britain. It grew, and still does, on cliff tops and seawalls and the landward side of salt marshes. It resembles common scurvy grass in its fleshy leaves and small, four-petaled white flowers, but must have some latent weedy gene that its commoner cousin lacks, some intrinsic willingness to tolerate facsimiles of the true shoreline. In the mid-1980s, it began to appear on a few inland railway line sites where its seeds had been introduced with stone rubble brought from the seashore. Then it began to show up along the edges of motorways and major roads. What I love about Richard Mabey's writing is he manages to convey a huge amount of information in his books, but he does it in an incredibly elegant and readable way. And there's something about this piece, which is why I kind of homed in on this in the book, is the way that you feel it, you have that real sense of it's going somewhere. This is a story of a plant that he tells as you might tell the story of a person traveling. It has that real sort of, it has a real narrative arc, which is something that is a really good thing, I think, to aspire to in any nature writing. So even if you were writing something much more literary, creative, there's absolutely no reason why it still shouldn't have that narrative arc. And I think Richard Mabey does that brilliantly. So the final piece, I'm once again going to hand over to Paul.
So this is Stephen Lovett, and it's a lovely book. My son bought me this out just after lockdown, and this is placed in lockdown. Each morning I do a round of nests I've discovered, and thus I have a routine too. My own orbit altered by the great gravity of their purpose in preparing for the world the next generation of birds. My first stop is at the nest of a pair of coloured doves who have built alarmingly low down in a pollarded linden outside a drug rehabilitation centre on a quiet street. The nest is fairly well screened by leaves, but there's a passage for the eye into the cool shade near the trunk. At the other end, I think it's near the trunk, at the other end of which I can see the mild black eye of the dove, set dead center in the putty-coloured feathers of her head. So I've got drunk written on my
mistake. Version. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
But you 100% the shape.
You can see why I might have ended up writing drunk, but
well, we had drug rehabilitation centre, and that's it. Yeah, and it's an extraordinary setting that is painted. Yeah, but that's the point of it, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think what's about this piece, a little bit like Richard's, but in a different approach. It feels almost filmic. It feels like you're travelling down the road with him, and then the camera is zooming in closer and closer until you get to that point where it's looking at the eye of this dove. And there's something wonderful about that sort of starts big picture and then focuses right down. And that's another really useful writing device, and something that I think I perhaps overused, but something about starting big, then homing in closer and closer till you get to that, the kind of subject of your piece. So there were 4 completely different sorts of writing, but clearly what they all have in common, they're all talking about nature somewhere you're not expecting to find it. So hopefully that'll provide a bit of inspiration, and ready for our next exercise. So for exercise 2, what I'm going to ask you to do is to try really hard and not overthink what you did as your pre-workshop activity. So I'm hoping as many of you as possible had the opportunity to find nature somewhere that was perhaps a surprising place, an unlikely place. So what I want you to do is describe where you were, what nature you found, and why it was unexpected. And when I say overthink, what I mean is try not to edit it as you go along. Try to literally get the content down on the sheet. And the reason for doing, well, I say sheet or screen, The reason for doing it like this is if you are ever caught out with that feeling of, oh my God, there's an empty page in front of me, how do I start? This can be a useful way of unblocking that. So not thinking too much, but literally just writing the content. And then there's plenty of opportunity to go back and edit it afterwards. So if you're ever in that position, this can be useful. So you're going to have about 10 minutes to do this. So you can do quite a full description in that time, even if for your 50 words you have to cut it down. Now, for those of you, if you didn't have a chance to do the pre-workshop activity, then what I suggest is if you haven't already found a picture of nature in an unexpected place, then have a look for one now and base your writing on that. So you'll have a little bit less time, obviously, but it means that at least you can join in with that activity. So as I said, it's going to be about 10 minutes. No, in fact, it will be exactly 10 minutes. And I will give you a 1-minute warning as we get close to the end. So over to you. You have a minute left. So that brings us to the end of exercise 2. I'm perhaps for some of you that might have been a different way of approaching writing. Hopefully it was. And as I said, it can be useful when you're feeling quite paralyzed with where to start a piece of writing. It's an approach that I quite often take if I'm writing features, because I've often talked to people first, done some interviews, done a bit of research, and I find just plonking it on the page without thinking too much about how I'm writing it and then turning it into a feature article is a lot more straightforward than starting at the beginning and then working through. So can be a useful tool, as I said. So what next? Well, so arguably you could say it's all in the edit, and that's what turns a piece of writing into a really exciting piece of writing to be proud of. And what we're going to look at over the series of this workshops is different things that you can do when you edit. So things to add to your toolbox. And the first thing we're going to think about is sentence length, which perhaps the warm-up exercise gave you a clue to. So why sentence length? Well, short sentences and single words can add punch and drama to your writing. Longer sentences can add rhythm. So short sentences, we saw that in some of the readings we had earlier, the Wren, for example, whereas Richard maybe doesn't tend to do that punchy sort of short sentence stuff. He uses longer sentences, but his writing is very rhythmic, so it can make reading out loud, you know, when you're reading his work out loud, it can really help with the reading. If you combine those two things, so you don't do all of one or all of the other, that can really help hold your reader's attention. So beneath that, what I've put there is 2 different bits of writing, which I've called before and after. And so if we imagine that the before is when I've had this idea that I want to write about a standoff between the foxes and the crows outside my window, which is where I saw this. So this is me just getting it down on paper, getting something down that gives me the kind of content, a little bit like you did in exercise 2. So there's a grass alley between the suburban garden fences. At high noon, there's a fox at one end and 2 crows at the other. The crow's nest is in a sycamore overhead. The fox inches forward and then stops and starts, and he's watched every step. He decides it's not worth it, turns and lopes away while I breathe out gently. So after I'd written it in that way, I started thinking, I got into my head the idea of High Noon, and it just reminded me of the film High Noon, which I don't know if you know, it's a kind of classic Western with shootout in a street at high noon, of course. And so I wanted to kind of build on that sort of slightly truncated way that Westerns can be presented, or these classic Westerns can be presented. So in my edit, what I'm now thinking about is how can I use sentence lengths and variety in sentence length to get that punchiness into my writing. So, suburban high noon, grass alley between garden fences. At one end, a fox. At the other, 2 crows forage all casual-like, their nest in a sycamore overhead. Fox inches forward, stops, starts, watched every step. No, not worth it, mate. He turns and lopes away. I breathe out gently. So I'm not saying that necessarily you should like the second one more, but clearly what I was doing the second one was very consciously thinking about sentence length as an approach. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do now. So for the final exercise, I'm going to ask you to rework what you have done for exercise 2 into a polished piece of thumbnail nature, maximum 50 words, including the title if you want one. So on the theme of in the most unlikely place. But the key thing is to be really conscious of sentence length. Now, being conscious doesn't mean you have to do short sentences, long sentences. You don't have to approach it in the way that I did in that previous piece. But even if you choose to have the same length sentences, do that consciously. So what I'm asking is focus on that so you're thinking about it and making a conscious decision rather than it just happening by accident. So you may end up with identical length sentences, or you might have a mixture of short and long, but you've chosen that approach and you're using that to try and achieve what you want to achieve with your piece of writing. So you're going to have a little bit longer to do this so that you can hopefully polish it into a final piece of thumbnail nature. And once again, I will give you a 1 minute warning as we get close to the end. Okay, so over to you, and I hope you enjoy it. You have a minute left. So that's the end of exercise 3. And you may well feel you need a little bit more time. However, before we finish off the formal bit, I just wanted to do a little recap of what we've been talking about today. So these are the takeaways and some tips for compelling nature writing as you continue with your nature writing. So the first one was this idea that if you're struggling to start writing, to try not to overthink your first draft is an approach to it. It's not the only one, but it can be one that is useful. And just get the content down without thinking too much about how you're writing. Just think about what you're writing. So then in the edit, that's your opportunity to polish and turn this into a really exciting and interesting piece of writing. But consider using sentence length as a tool to achieve your particular objectives, and to add drama and rhythm works really well for that. So you'll notice whenever we do these exercises, I always give you less time for exercise 2, the content bit, the first draft, than I do for the editing. And in practice, it would be better to spend even more time on the editing and polishing. So I reckon that approximately in my writing, I spend about 1/3 of the time doing the drafting, and then about 2/3 of it doing editing and polishing. And it's a really good habit to get into, particularly if you have any interest in the future of trying to get your writing published. One of the things that will make editors of magazines absolutely love you is if you produce pieces of writing that are professional and print ready. So, and you get a reputation for that. So, and some people get reputations for the opposite. So it's really important to really polish and do the best possible piece of writing you can do, and don't let typos, etc., slip into it. So that would be my recommendation. So what next? Well, following this workshop, please give your 50 words, or finish off your 50 words, including the title. I know I keep saying this, but we always get one which doesn't include the title in the 50 words. But give it a final polish if you haven't finished it now, which I suspect most of you won't have done. If you'd like that piece of thumbnail on the theme of In the Most Unlikely Place to be considered for inclusion in an online anthology on my blog, please email it to me at amandaduke.writes@gmail.com before midnight on this Sunday, the 20th of November. Any relevant photos that you'd like to be included, do send them to, if you're happy for me to share them online. If you're not ready for that, and you're fairly new to nature writing, do at least share your piece of thumbnail nature with one other person that you trust. That's the first step, showing it to someone. You don't need to ask them to respond if you don't want to, but it's just really good to take that first step and show somebody else what you've written, and then you can build on that. So I'm hoping that as many of you as possible will send me something. I've received some from the workshop I did last night, and they look great and really fun, and have clearly had a fun time playing around with sentence length. And hopefully, if this was the first time you thought about nature in an urban place, you might be inspired to look at that again another time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off the screen sharing, Just bear with me. I'm also going to turn off the recording